everyone, and welcome to Jackson Hole Eco Tour Adventures Wildlife Wednesday Monthly Roundup. I'm Tenley.
And I'm Tyler.
And we've got some great videos from all over the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem to show you this month, and the latest updates on all of our favorite critters.
Oh yeah.
Let's go ahead and get started and look at some bear hibernation and what really goes into it from a chemical perspective with Laura.
Hi everyone, this is Laura. This time of the year, in the middle of the winter, we all want to imagine our local bears snuggled into their dens, all happy, safe, and warm until spring. In the spring, when they come out of their torpid state, they're going to be just as strong as when they went into their den in the fall or early winter. Although they've lost some fat reserves over the winter, they do not lose any of their muscle mass. And to me, that's quite amazing. Bears are able to recycle proteins within their body and also waste products in their body, which are processed during their torpid state. Let me explain. To me, wild animals have evolved with traits that make them able to perform like superheroes. For bears, their superhero trait is that they're able to sleep or go into a state of torpor or light hibernation for months at a time. And when they get out of bed, they're just as strong as when they went into their den in the fall. For humans, if we could adapt that behavior or adapt the ability to recycle nutrients within our body, we might be able to go to a different planet. We might be able to travel to Mars. We might be able to stay in a coma for a long amount of time. We might even be able to fix ailments like kidney diseases that afflict many people. When our bodies, or the bear's body, is functioning normally, we create a waste product called urea. Urea is created in the liver when we break down proteins or amino acids, and then it's transferred into the bloodstream, where the kidneys will filter out that urea into the bladder, and then we pee it out. But sometimes, like in the case of a bear that's in hibernation, they're not excreting anything. They're not going to the bathroom throughout the winter. Also, if a human has a problem with his or her kidney, then that could mean excess waste products or excess urea and nitrogen could build up in the bloodstream, which will make you pretty sick. So bears have developed this system to be able to recycle urea within their body and turn it into useful material, including protein, to reuse it during hibernation. This gets kind of complicated, but please bear with me. This is pretty interesting. When bears are in their dens, we assume that they're just sleeping, but in reality, their bodies are performing complex conversions to convert waste products into proteins that they can use. And don't worry, at the end of all of this, it will result in bear farts. So, of course, we're starting out with that urea stuff. It's produced by the liver, which goes into the bloodstream. Normally, the urea would then pass into the kidneys, which filters out the urea into the urine, and then that's what makes the yellow snow. But in this case, a bear's not going to the bathroom because he's in his den. So the urea passes into the saliva instead. And then that saliva is swallowed by a sleeping bear, which enters the intestines, which house special bacteria. And the bacteria help to break the urea down into bicarbonate and ammonia. Ammonia gets transferred into protein. And the bicarbonate, which is more like a waste product, gets broken down by acid created by the bacteria, which is then separated into carbon dioxide and water. Water helps to keep the bear from getting dehydrated, gets reabsorbed into the bear's system, whereas the carbon dioxide gets farted out as bear flatulence in the den. I'm assuming that bear dens are very stinky places. So we can add this metabolic conversion to the superhero traits that bears possess. Other cool things that they can do are climb trees. They can dig their own dens. A bear can do about 50 yards in 3 seconds. They mate in the springtime and then give birth to their cubs in February. And if you scroll back, check out some of our other episodes, I'll explain that too. But thank you for watching. If you have a superhero trait that you'd like me to know about, please mention it in the comments. And I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Laura, so much for teaching us about the chemical pathways of bears in hibernation. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't know if I would want to be in a bear den with them farting all winter long. Yeah, definitely some interesting facts there. All right, so next we're going to talk about our most abundant herbivore during the winter, elk, which we see all the time, just 3 blocks that way on the National Elk Refuge.
Elk are very well adapted for surviving in a wintry landscape. They have incredibly thick fur and thick skin, and their long legs keep them up above the cold snow and ground layer. Now, one of the most important aspects for their winter survival out here is a consistent supply of food. And oftentimes we'll see elk, like these cows here, gather up on barren hillsides where the wind has maybe swept away the snow or the sun has melted the snow away, and there the elk can feed on those open patches where the vegetation is exposed. Now, not every single habitat that the elk live in is going to have patches of open vegetation, and they're going to have to dig through the snow, just like this bull elk is doing here, to reach the grass and vegetation beneath the snow layer. Now, that means that elk have to migrate, oftentimes hundreds of miles. Now, migration takes a huge amount of energy expenditure, and it really only occurs in landscapes where you have a varying amount of elevation and habitat. Now, unfortunately, because of the rigors of migration and the rigors of just living in a harsh wintry landscape, some of the elk out here inevitably die. But their bodies provide a really valuable food source for a variety of scavengers and carnivores out here. Eagles, ravens, and magpies pictured here, and a variety of mammals such as foxes and coyotes all depend on elk as a winter food source. Without these carcasses to scavenge upon, these carnivores and scavengers would have to travel hundreds of miles in order to find enough food on their own to survive. Some of the elk that succumb the most to the winter are actually the bull elk. Here's a nice male with some big antlers. The reason that these males are oftentimes the one to die during winter is because they spend a lot of energy during the mating season courting females and chasing them around. That means by the time February and March rolls around, they tend to be the weakest members in the herd.
Thanks, Tyler. That was a pretty great look at the National Elk Refuge and our local elk population. All right, next up, we have one of my favorite winter critters doing one of the favorite things I like to see on tour, which is red foxes hunting for prey. Let's check it out.
Woo-hoo.
Hey everyone, this is Laura. The winter season gives us a great opportunity to see red foxes in the greater Yellowstone area. Red fox, who are a relatively small mammal, at about 10 to 12 pounds, stand up on top of the mid to late winter snowpack and become a lot more visible. Foxes might be out and about on top of our thick snowpack, hunting for rodents. Sometimes we see a fox stop and tilt his head right to left to better hear or triangulate the sound of a rodent down beneath the snow. Then he might dig with his paws, or if he's sure of the location of that rodent using the Earth's magnetic field, he might dive in head first with his tail wagging in the air to tackle or capture a rodent for a meal. And for me, that's one of the most exciting things to see in the greater Yellowstone area, especially if that fox is successful. Fox walk really well on top of our thick snowpack. They've got extra fur between their toes to help support their body weight on top of the snow, almost like they're wearing natural snowshoes. That fur also helps to insulate their paws from the cold. Around here, fox are quite fluffy. They've got really nice big full tails, which they use to curl up in when they bed down for a nap or for the night. Our North American red fox is a species that originated in the Old World over in Europe. We think that our red fox of North America deviated genetically from the European fox about 400,000 years ago. So likely they crossed what was known as the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia over into North America a long time ago, and then have been evolving in isolation from those European foxes ever since. Contrary to their common name, red fox, our local foxes can be born in a variety of colors. Of course, we do have red or light red colored red foxes here, but we also have cross foxes, silver foxes, and the occasional black fox. Cross fox means a cross or combination of red and black coloration. Usually those individuals will have a cross of color right over their shoulder. Occasionally we do see silver or even black colored red foxes. They're still part of the same species, but they have what's called melanism, or too much pigment in their fur, giving them that dark appearance, as black as my jacket. But the silver and black colored foxes that I've seen around here still maintain that little white tip on the end of their tail.
Thanks, Laura, so much for talking with us twice, actually, this broadcast. Laura is one of our most knowledgeable guides out here. Well, now it's time to move on for our next favorite segment, or our second next favorite segment.
Well, my second favorite.
Yeah.
Maybe it's your favorite.
I don't know. I'm trivia master, and so it's kind of my favorite.
Yeah.
Awesome, guys. We're going to move on to trivia now. And so if you guys remember last month, we did ask a trivia question, and I hope you guys all had a chance to answer that question. And then this month, we're going to have our own unique question again. But before that, we are going to show you guys our sponsored web store item. Yeah. This month, it's a kind of a different one. I wanted to show you guys some of the books that we have available in the web store. I have read two of these books, Wolves in Yellowstone and Death in Yellowstone. And they are both really great reads. Yep. Death in Yellowstone is kind of a more morbid read, for sure. While Wolves in Yellowstone is definitely a more scientific one. And I'm going to have to add Phantom of the North, that third book, on there to my reading list so that I can teach everyone about great gray owls while out on tour. Yeah.
If you're interested in any of our web store items, we will be giving out a gift card for your chance to win if you answer our trivia question of the month correctly. And you can go to our web store with your free gift card and buy one of those books for yourself. So if those look interesting, just go ahead and answer in the comment section what you think the answer to this month's trivia question is for your chance to win. In the meantime, Bo, another one of our guides, is moderating the comment section tonight. So everybody say hi to Bo. He's going to put up a link to our web store and to some of those great books so that you guys can get a chance to see all of the great resources we have available all about the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as well as local art, gifts, and other goodies. As always, we've got lots of stuff to check out over there. If you would rather just donate to the guides in return for this free broadcast, we're always happy to offer it for free. It's really fun for us to do it. But if you want to support Laura and Tyler and some of our other folks, you can do that on the web store as well. So definitely check that out if that's of interest. But in the meantime, take it away, Trivia Master.
Well, we're going to first cover last month's trivia question, which we were both really excited about. I hope we didn't give it away to you guys.
We totally
we saw lots of great answers. Here's the question from last month. What animal made this track? And we actually had a couple guides come across some tracks from this animal while doing some backcountry skiing. And if you guessed C, Wolverine, then great job. You got it correct. One of the ways you can tell this is a Wolverine track is because it does have 5 toes, which is diagnostic for any animal in the mustelid family. An animal in the mustelid family would be an animal related to weasels. So either a long-tailed weasel or an otter, a wolverine, badgers, often known for their voracious attitudes. Wolverines are not an animal we see here very often. A couple years ago, we had one cross the valley. I don't know if anyone saw it. They knew it crossed because of GPS points. The scientists were tracking it. Yeah. But thank you all for participating in last month's trivia question. And now we'll do this month's trivia question. What year was the Elk Refuge established? And if you don't know a whole lot about the National Elk Refuge, the Elk Refuge was established to help protect elk as their migration routes were cut off, and to provide habitat that was slowly being eaten away by development primarily. Yeah. And so the Elk Refuge is super important for us and for the elk. And we're always happy to get out there and to see the animals. And by the way, these videos were taken on a sleigh ride, which we actually get to do on tour occasionally, which is pretty exciting. Yeah.
So if you think you know the answer to this month's trivia question, just go ahead and answer in the comments. Of all of the correct answers, we'll choose one lucky person to win a gift card to our EcoTour web store. And of course, next month, we will go ahead, just like we just did with last month's trivia question, give everyone the answer. We'll see. That one's kind of a harder one. We've been told that our questions have been too easy lately, although I think the Wolverine was tough.
But we kind of gave it away. We were like, we gave too many hints.
We were super excited and giddy about it, so you knew it had to be something rare. We always have a lot of zest as guides to find really unusual things, and so we are really excited. We did have a record this month. We had a guide on tour for the very first time see a Canada lynx, which in many ways is almost as difficult as to see a wolverine. So we have a record board at the office where we keep track of our all-time records. And congratulations to Mark for getting the record of the missing lynx, which is the first lynx in EcoTour Adventures history on tour. We have yet to have a winner find a wolverine on tour, and that is to get it. The name of it is to get a Hugh Jackman. If you get a Hugh Jackman on tour, that means you've seen a wolverine with guests. So congratulations to Mark.
I feel like seeing a lynx is more rare than seeing a wolverine. Because like wolverines, they actually have a breeding population here. Lynx just kind of like pass through between Montana and Colorado. Yeah. So seeing a lynx is more rare.
It's really a big deal. So we're very excited for Mark. One of these days I'm going to get a Hugh Jackman. It's before I retire, I will see a Wolverine on tour. But until that happens, if you have any great sighting stories, do let us know in the comment section. All right, it's time for my favorite part of the program, which is we're here to answer your questions live. If you have a question about the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, Grand Teton, Yellowstone, National Elk Refuge, wildlife, the natural world, questions from young and old. We'll take questions from 3-year-olds and 99-year-olds. Anything that you're interested in hearing about, Tyler and I are here to answer your questions. Feel free to ask us some stumpers. Those are always our favorite. Now, the way this is going to work is we've got our iPad here where we're looking at your questions live. If you have a question, we'll go ahead and we'll see it. And so bear with us as we're scrolling down and looking as we answer. If you are watching this program and it's been shared and it's not on our original broadcast page, you do need to be on the Jacksonville EcoTour Adventures page for us to see your question. Sometimes when it's shared, we can't necessarily see the comments. So I will definitely get to everything, as will Tyler, that we can see. All right, let's kind of go back and we'll go to some of the ones that were asked a little early on, and then we'll go from there. Lee asks, in the dead of winter, what animals can you see in Grand Teton National Park? And do I have to use snowshoes, or can I see animals from your van? Well, Leah, that's a great question. And of course you can. We run wildlife tours 365 days a year. We also, of course, run cross-country ski and snowshoe. But yeah, gosh, what did we see today? Let's think about this. Elk, bison, moose.
Some people saw wolves.
Coyotes, mule deer, foxes, bald eagles.
Did we say sheep? Bighorn sheep?
We saw bighorn sheep today. There were golden eagles that were out.
Lots of winter birds like ducks and swans.
Oh, somebody saw an American dipper today.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Let's see, what else did we see today? This is just today on tour. So we see lots of wildlife. You know, you don't have to get out on snowshoes to get a good view of wildlife. We take people of all ability level and activity level. There's plenty of wildlife you can see from our vehicles, but there's also lots of great wildlife, and particularly track and sign that you can see it on one of our snowshoe tours. So great question, Lee. Thank you very much. We sure appreciate that.
Occasionally on our snowshoe tours, we get really lucky and we see some rare animals. On a lot of my snowshoe tours and a lot of other guide snowshoe tours, we have been seeing a porcupine regularly, which is not an animal we see here very often. And so it's always great to see the tracks and signs, but also to occasionally get a surprise animal while out on a snowshoe or a ski tour.
Yeah.
And so it does happen. You never know what you might find. I've run into moose and coyotes on tour, and so sometimes you just have to go out and see what you can find.
A great way to check out the latest sightings that we've been seeing as we see them throughout the week is if you're on Instagram, you can go to our stories, and we're always putting up all the kind of cool, crazy, weird critters that we've seen lately. So some examples of that, we saw a very pale colored raccoon.
So cool.
We're not sure if it's an albino or it's showing piebaldism or something along those lines, but Sarah Ernst has a bizarre looking raccoon, a very, very rare animal for us that's probably common in lots of other places where you might live, but really unusual for us is a skunk.
Yeah.
We had a skunk sighting. I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times I've seen a skunk in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem. So that was actually very exciting for all of us.
I've seen one, so, and it wasn't on tour.
We had a couple pine martens this year, American
Cool.
martens, which is another species of weasel. They're one of my favorites. We lovingly call them by a terrible nickname at the office. We call them murder slinkies because they're really good at eating squirrels and they're very flexible. So
When
that's
they're bounding through the snow, they almost shrink and stretch like a slinky.
like a slinky. It's a terrible
And
name.
I actually feel like we should call otters water slinkies.
Water slinkies.
So Sarah Ernst and I were on a multi-day back in January, and in Hayden Valley we saw an otter, and it was slinking, like literally looked like a slinky or
Like an inchworm.
like inchworm, like
Yeah.
across the ice.
Water slinky. Oh.
Or
Yeah.
ice slinky.
We also name all of our vans and our vehicles, and the guides name them. And we've got a new rig coming soon. So we've been thinking through different names, and
Ooh, yeah.
Water Slinky sounds
Water
really
Slinky.
fun.
Yeah, and if you guys have any ideas, fun ideas for names, let us know
what
in
do you
the
think
comments.
we should name our
Yeah.
van? It should be something fun and lovable. And let's see some examples of current ones. Speed Goat, which
Chocolate moose.
Speed Goat's, Chocolate Moose. That's our newest SUV. Speed Goat's just a nickname we give to pronghorn antelope around here because their closest relative, well, actually technically their closest relative is a giraffe, but one of their closest relatives is a goat. Slippery Otter.
Slippery
We
otter.
already have an otter. Yeah.
But you could call it Slinky. I don't think we should name a van Murder Slinky, though.
No, that seems a little rough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a great idea. I'm kind of in favor of naming a van after a badger.
That'd be a good one.
Yeah, I'm kind of campaigning for Bodacious Badger, personally. But thank you very much, Lee, for that great question. We kind of got on a tangent there.
We should just name all of our creatures after mustelids. Or all of our
All the
vans after mustelids.
will just be mustelids. Oh, I love that. Yeah, that would be actually really fun. I'm all aboard. God, we're nerds. That'd be great.
I know.
An ermine and a wolverine and a
We have to do,
and
a
a water
badger.
slinky.
Yeah.
I love it. Mark asks, any festivities going on for Yellowstone's 151st anniversary? Mark, I don't know of any. I think everybody's still on a hangover from the 150th anniversary. But, of course, we are celebrating that. So congratulations. Happy birthday, Yellowstone. We're so glad that you're here and that we are able to live out our lives and our careers in such an amazing place. So,
Exactly.
good point. It is the 151st anniversary this month, I believe. So congratulations. That's pretty great. And I don't think there's anything special planned just because, of course, Yellowstone is not fully open to car travel in the winter. The vast majority of the interior of the park is only open to snow coach travel. I wouldn't be surprised if at Old Faithful or something, they have some balloons or something out just to quietly sort of point out that it's the anniversary today. That wouldn't surprise me. But congratulations. Happy birthday, Yellowstone. That's a great point. Thanks,
And
Mark.
last year they didn't celebrate until May, and then they had like this exclusive VIP party, which I was not invited to.
Yeah, but
But it
we
would
were
have been
there.
fun.
Remember,
we were there. That's why I remember it.
Yeah, so we were up there training, and the governor was there, and the director of the park service, and there was all these VIPs, and they were all dressed to the nines, and we were all just wandering around.
We were all in the parking lot, and we were like doing presentations on like Old Faithful and all these facts, and all the guides all of a sudden like looked up towards like the Old Faithful Inn, and we're like,
why is everybody in,
we're
like,
in the middle
black tie
of Yellowstone, yeah, and everyone's like dressed up like it's the gala or something.
And
like,
they were all on the roof of Old Faithful, which is not open to the public. You have to be somebody really special, like a Make-A-Wish Foundation kid or something like that. Because after the 1955 Lake Hebgen earthquake, it's not stable enough to allow the general public to go up there all the time. But all these like VIPs were up there. And so, we were all up there training and learning about all the thermal features. And we were going, why is everybody dressed up in like these literally black dresses in the middle of Yellowstone?
And I'm curious, did they shut like the inn down? Like, were no guests there? No guests.
No
were there.
guests. Yeah, it was a VIP only soiree. Is that the right term? It was pretty great. All right, let's see here. Don asks, I brought 2 teenagers out on a hike, and they constantly wanted to go off trail to see a river or up a hill. They thought I was overdoing it. Can you share your expertise on off trail hiking? This is a good one.
This is a really good one. Yeah.
I like this one.
So, you know, I do a lot of off-trail hiking on my own. I grew up in Colorado, and so I've been doing it my entire life, really started with my dad. And when you're in a national park, there's a couple of things you should consider when off-trail hiking. First off is the national park doesn't encourage it. And that's because, especially in Yellowstone, there's not a lot of cell service, and it's really easy to get lost up there. And it can also be very dangerous, depending on weather conditions and whether or not you're in an area with dangerous game. And you also need to be able to navigate properly. And so if I do off-trail hiking, I always take a GPS with me, and I typically look very specifically at the spot I'm going to before I just don't randomly go off trail on a hike. And I definitely on tour don't take people off trail. Most of our people that we take on tour prefer to stick to the trails, and I believe it's within our permits to stay on those trails. And so that's definitely not something that we do while we're on tour in Yellowstone or Grand Teton. But it is a really cool way if you do it in a safe way to explore areas that are kind of off the beaten path. I do a lot of bird watching off of the trail, and it can be really cool. Oh, another thing that you should consider though is we don't want to be trampling vegetation. And so if you're in like a high use area, it's best to stay on designated trails and not to wander off into the woods, especially with other people around, because that could also encourage them to leave the path and to hurt the environment and trample vegetation. I know in Grand Teton National Park, there's been a couple of places where this is a major problem, not just for the vegetation, but for erosion, for disturbance of wildlife. It can be so bad that the park has actually, over the past decade or so, implemented many different closures, particularly around archaeological sites and sensitive wildlife. A good example would be bald eagles, and so that are nesting. And so we want to be really sensitive when we go off trail, making sure that we're not endangering animals or disturbing them or damaging the habitat or vegetation.
So here's where it gets really complicated. In areas with really great density of people, in America's national treasures, we really have to do what's in the best interest for the long term for the people of the United States. And so sometimes that means not everybody gets to do everything that they want to do in these very populated locations, or we wouldn't have any vegetation left in those places. In areas that are way back in wilderness, that are very remotely located, one of my great joys in life is thinking about the fact that I might be walking where no one has ever set foot in their lives. It's possible. Unlikely, but occasionally possible, depending on where I am. There are places where off-trail travel is not only acceptable, not only allowed, not only in some cases a bit encouraged, but is the only possible mechanism of getting from place to place. And so I think it's important to understand the values of the landscape you're in and make decisions based on the appropriateness of the wildlife, the landscapes, and the density of where you're traveling, and do what's in the best interest of the landscape before you do what's in isn't necessarily what would be in your best interest or enjoyment. So it's a controversial topic. It's a complicated topic. But when it comes to the national parks, we really do have to take care of them for the next generation. And they are very, very heavily visited. And as a result, it can cause a lot of damage.
Yeah,
Yep.
we have millions of people that come to Yellowstone every single year. And sometimes in Yellowstone, it can get so bad that like in Hayden Valley, there'll be like bison on the side of the road. And so many people will stop and walk out of their vehicles to go and see those bison that they wear down pathways, and they trample all these wildflowers and stuff. And literally they can turn entire hillsides into just like dust balls. And so it is really important when you are in those high crowded situations to not be like a trendsetter, not to like lead the crowd into the forest.
Yeah. So hopefully that's helpful there, Don. Let's see here. Oh man, Mark, this is a good one. We've been debating this. So we're going to tell you what we know and then encourage you to look into the matter more. So Mark asks, what's the difference between a cross fox and a melanistic fox? Okay, so color variations vary dramatically from species to species, and you can have different ways that colors are formed, right? So sometimes colors are formed by genetic inheritance, and color is formed very simply. You'll just have a color. Sometimes colors are formed because two different colors or even three different colors will overlap in a hair pattern to create an entirely unique color. So let's use dogs as an example because I think it's really useful. You can have a black lab or a yellow lab or a chocolate lab. Those are all color variations that are genetically based, that are based on the color genetics of the parents. And then you can have incomplete dominance colors, like you'll sometimes see in something like a German Shepherd, where the black and the gold or even the silver will kind of overlap and create a third color. A really good example of this would be like heelers, or Australian cattle dogs, or dogs like that, where the colors are actually almost kind of blending, creating new colors. A really good example of this would be in like cows and horses, where you see the color roan. Roan would be incomplete dominance. Okay, so a cross fox is showing kind of a roan pattern. A melanistic fox has a genetic inheritance to be dark colored. So Tyler, you're probably better at explaining this than I am because he's got more biology than I do. But the short version is melanism, which would be, there's too much pigment produced, or albinism, which is a lack of pigment produced, or piebaldism, which is too much pigment in some places and not enough pigment in other places. Those are considered genetic abnormalities. They're rare, they're unusual. An all white animal with pink eyes is not producing pigment at all. That's sometimes called a genetic defect, but it's certainly a genetic abnormality. So a melanistic fox is producing too much dark pigment. A really famous example of that's probably the most widespread variation would be jaguars are normally spotted, but there are black jaguars that are just melanistic. They're just producing black and have become really predominant. Cross foxes are a little different.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to this sort of thing, it's not a one size fits all. Yeah. You have to really look into the species biology and into their genetics and their chemical pathways to understand exactly what's going on. And in this scenario, we don't know exactly what's going on with the foxes. There's probably a genetic predisposition. There could also be a chemical pathway. One thing that we learn is that albinism is purely genetic, but leucistic animals, which look very similar to albino animals, that is more of a chemical pathway, which can be genetic, but it could also be an underproduction of melanin. And so these things are very complex. As far as when it comes to animal colors, the three biggest things that kind of influence that are genetics, the chemical pathway, and then for certain species, not for mammals, but for birds and reptiles, sometimes their diet will determine.
Oh, he's getting it even more complicated, you guys.
Their diet. So the best example is flamingos.
Oh yeah.
So flamingos eat red algae, or some flamingos eat red algae, the lesser flamingo does, and their body actually absorbs that pigment into their feathers. They can't actually produce the color pink, which is why some flamingos in zoos, when they're not fed the correct food, will lose their colors entirely and will be pure white. And so in nature, it's definitely not an all size fits all, and it gets more complex when you throw people into the mix. Yeah. And what I mean by that is like domestic animals, just through like selective breeding, which is, I've heard, has had an effect on fox populations in certain areas.
Yes.
I don't know specifically if it has happened here, but foxes have been taken in as pets, have been domesticated. Whether or not they make good pets is up for debate. Some of those foxes were re-released. Some of them were bred in captivity, either in a fur farm or as pets, and then were released into the wild. And they have influenced the color of wild foxes really across the globe.
Yeah.
Which is super interesting.
And a lot of this is all brand new science, because a lot of these genomes were only now beginning to detect. So when I was back in college, they were just getting done with like the dog DNA and the dog genome, and just beginning to understand coloration for something that common, horses, things like that. So we're just now getting to things like wolves. I'm not even sure they've gotten to foxes yet. But a really good example of what we're kind of talking about, black wolves, that is a gene that is inherited. But interestingly enough, that gene probably originally comes from dogs.
Yeah.
There probably weren't black wolves.
Uh-huh.
They probably inherited that through inheriting that back through dogs, through humans creating black color, and then it affecting the natural world. So it gets really complicated really quick. But it's one of my weird nerdy hobbies. I like to keep track of these. I find color variation really fascinating. A really good example of some of these things that I kind of mean, the ungulate family, particularly the deer family, has an unusually high rate of albinism, for instance.
Yeah.
So you're much more likely to see a white albino deer than you are to see a white albino of another kind of mammal species. It's a little bit more common. We don't necessarily know why, but albinism is more common, for instance, in horses as well. So just hoofed mammals seem to have a higher rate of it. Albinism and leucism is more common in big cats, as is melanism. So we're getting into the things like white tigers now, and we're getting into, black jaguars and that kind of thing. We don't know why it's more common in cats, but it is, which sort of fascinates me as well. And then there are some really crazy things that happen that are connections. So there's a very famous genetic study that was done on foxes in Russia, sort of earlier in the last century, where they started breeding for domesticity. It was a fox farm, and they were both breeding foxes, but also studying genetics. And they started only reproducing the foxes that were more friendly. And over time, the foxes developed spots and floppy ears.
Yeah.
And so it's thought that it's possible that the reason dogs oftentimes have spots and floppy ears has more to do with them being domesticated and less to be bred for a specific color if it goes across the lines. And so they were breeding for friendliness and for domestication and propensity to not bite and not show fear, and what they got instead were floppy ears and spots. So all sorts of things are connected on these chromosomes, on these genomes, and one thing can have great effect on another. So I love talking about this stuff. If you ever go out with me on tour, we have these iPads where we show visuals. I have a whole folder of like weird genetic variations. If you let me get started, I will not torture you guys.
It gets weird.
But it gets really fun really quickly. And it's one of my favorite topics to nerd out about. So thanks for bringing it out, because you made my day.
If you want to read more about those Russian foxes, I believe Nat Geo did an article on those foxes, and I believe you can go look it up online.
Oh man, Bo, I know that's asking a lot, but maybe Bo can find it and post it in the comment section.
Do like quick Google search.
Maybe. I'm not familiar necessarily with this article, but hopefully he can find it for us.
I think it was like 2012 or something like that.
We're just torturing
Yeah.
Bo now. But
Good luck, Bo.
Michael, this is a great question. Have you noticed whether hibernating animals are waking up earlier? So we're getting into one of these really complicated things. Everybody wants to see evidence of climate change in the everyday. And the reason they want to do that is because it's an urgent issue. And so, do you guys remember, I've talked about this on the show before, but remember when they discovered El Nino and then everything became El Nino's fault?
Yeah.
Remember that? So like...
It's almost like a trend.
Yeah,
like a problem
and they're
trend.
like, it's raining, it must be El Nino. It's not raining, it must be El Nino. And then they discovered La Nina a couple years later, and then it got like out of hand. Like, my football team lost, it's La Nina's fault. And no, weather is weather, and it is variable. And in the same way that climate change is absolutely occurring, and there's scientific consensus on that, There is evidence of that going on. We're seeing things like glacial melt and we're seeing rising temperatures, but more complex things like entry and exit of hibernation, that's going to take a little bit longer to show evidence occurring. And the problem is evidence is a little scanty at best anyway. We only started really looking at bear hibernation in the mid 1960s. And an understanding of when they're going in and leaving with such a secretive animal, it would be kind of hard to quantify over time without a baseline. So I don't have an answer because I don't think there is an answer, but my suspicion would be, I think it's probably more based on a hard winter versus a not so hard winter and the body condition of the individual versus immediately jumping to, oh gosh, our winters are warmer and they're shorter and they're less severe and hibernation is going for a shorter period. I have no doubt that in the next 100 years, we're going to see evidence of that. But I don't think we're seeing evidence of it yet.
And I think it's a good point to bring up that different hibernating animals have different behavioral variations, and bears have what we call high plasticity when it comes to that behavior, which means individual bears can change their behavior, their hibernating behavior, from year to year, versus an animal like a ground squirrel can't change that behavior. They have low plasticity, which means that if we want to really study the effects of climate change, it would be better to study the ground squirrels. And the reason for that is because the ground squirrels are not going to be able to adapt as readily as the bears, and that's going to affect their survival. One thing that's concerning with climate change is that the ranges of these smaller animals like amphibians, small rodents that are super specific to the climate that they live in are going to over time shift their range northward because they can't adapt as quickly, and ground squirrels would be a good example of that. Versus bears have variable hibernation across the species and across their range, meaning that bears in Alaska and Canada hibernate a lot longer than bears in Arizona. And that might seem obvious, but if we were to compare it to like a species of ground squirrel, like the Uinta ground squirrels that live here, their hibernation is consistent from year to year to year. It doesn't change no matter where they live, whether it's in Montana or Wyoming, or if they live in a warmer climate or a colder climate. And so it totally, once again, just similar to genetics, it depends on the animals, on the specific animal, and you have to look at that animal's specific biology before you decide if climate change is affecting them or not.
One of my favorite things about wildlife is they're enormously complex, and questions that seem relatively simple very quickly become really complicated. Male bears will hibernate for a different period of time than pregnant female bears, for instance. Black bears hibernate for a different period of time than grizzlies do. So I think that's just a tough one to study. Regardless, the fun thing about bears is they're not truly hibernating, and we don't need to get into that because that's a whole nother topic. Versus a ground squirrel. Ground squirrel's hibernating. It's a little bit of a different reaction, and Laura talked a little bit about this, but we did have a black bear locally wake up this week. One of the things to remember about bears is if they run out of body fat, they just wake back up. If you think of winter as a time of famine, a time of little food, rather than a time of cold, they're not hibernating because there's snow on the ground. They're hibernating because food is hard to find. And so there's that to keep in mind as well. Body conditions can have a real effect on that. Sadly, this little black bear who woke up was a youngster in very, very poor condition. And so probably woke up because he ran out of body fat. Unfortunately,
It sounded like it was a young bear. 1-year-old female, from what it sounds like. And it was a black bear, cinnamon in color. A lot of people were asking me on tour if it was a grizzly.
No.
And it was a brown colored black bear. And so I guess what happened is this bear was in the middle of a town looking for food in pretty poor body conditions, pretty emaciated. And Idaho Fish and Game went in there and tranquilized it. When an animal is in poor body conditions, they're more susceptible to drugs. And so that animal did not live. And definitely not Idaho Fish and Game's fault.
They didn't euthanize it.
They didn't euthanize it.
Didn't handle the drugs.
They were trying to take it out of town, and that animal was probably not going to survive.
Hanging out next to the elementary school, so they had to do something. And too bad. But it's a perfect example. I mean, it's March 1st. And so we do begin to see large male grizzlies wake up at the end of March. So we're getting towards that time of year.
And usually, I think last year it was March 13th, Yellowstone had their first bear sighting. So bear season is like, first bear sighting is only like 2 weeks away, based off of the average. So we'll see. Definitely makes me a little nervous sometimes.
Ryan, Ryan. Okay, so Ryan, for those of you guys who don't know, who's asking us a question, is one of our summertime guides. So he's asking about winter. Thanks, Ryan. Great question. Ryan asks, we miss you, by the way. Ryan
Ryan.
asks, what's the elk population estimate this year on the refuge? Are they also supplementally feeding 5 days a week or less? That's a good question.
This
So
is a good
I haven't
question.
gotten a biological update from the refuge for a couple of weeks. So my information's a little out of date.
I did a sleigh ride
Yeah.
like 2 weeks ago, and they said 7,100. It's
Okay.
probably a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
And
It
some
looks
of,
like it's a little more.
yeah, some of our guides have been reporting elk coming out of like the Grovemont River area, which leads directly onto the refuge, and so I bet it's a little bit higher now.
Yeah. And they are still supplementally feeding the population, and they will continue supplementally feeding the population until there is viable forage. The problem with supplementally feeding the elk is that once you start feeding them those alfalfa pellets so they survive the winter, which they'll do when forage becomes too poor, it fundamentally changes the bacteria in their gut system, and they can't go back to dried forage because the alfalfa pellets are so much more nutritionally viable. It changes the bacteria composition of their gut, and they can't keep eating those old dried withered winter grasses. So once they start feeding, they can't stop feeding until there's enough green viable grass on the ground that they can then transition to spring forage. So they will keep feeding until they feel like there's enough food. And that decision is made jointly by Wyoming Game and Fish and the National Elk Refuge biology staff. So yeah, a lot more elk this year than last year on the refuge. We're definitely seeing quite a few more of them. But the population looks pretty good considering the severity of the winter.
And one thing that has amazed me is that over the past 2 decades, the population in the Jackson elk herd has been incredibly stable.
Yeah.
At around 11,000 animals, the number of animals that go onto the refuge though fluctuates quite a bit from between, I believe the low is 5,000 to up to almost 11,000 animals. And so it does fluctuate, and that is all about the elk deciding where to survive, where to spend the winter. The National Elk Refuge is not the only place where elk live during the winter out here, and these animals are making decisions about their survival. And so some years they might decide to live on the elk refuge. And some years they might decide to go to the Grovemont area. Yeah. And so it totally depends on the individual elk and what their mother taught them, and then also what they decide to do for survival out here, which is super interesting. When they decide to feed them, just like what Tenley was saying about Wyoming Game and Fish and the National Elk Refuge making a joint decision on when to feed them, totally depends on the data that they're collecting out there on the refuge. They feed them when the viable food drops below 300 pounds per acre. And it also depends on snow conditions. And so I believe they started feeding January 16th this year was the start date for feeding. And there was viable forage, but the elk weren't able to access it because in December we had a rainstorm and it froze a super hard layer that the elk were having trouble digging through, which if you read anything about northern Canada, northern North America ungulate survival, rain in winter is awful for them. Yeah. They cannot get to their food if it rains and freezes.
Well, and when they do try to dig through that ice layer, the ice is sharp and it causes small scratches in their fetlocks, their hooves, their hoof areas, and those small scratches are really prone to infection in the winter. Yeah. Necrotic infection, which is invariably fatal. So we never want to see those rainstorms in December like we did this year. Yeah. So I was pleased to see that there were some options there. We would all prefer that we didn't have to feed the elk in the winter. That's a very controversial issue. In fact, I'm trying to remember, there's been 5 or 7 years that they haven't had to feed at all because the winter's been mild enough, but this has definitely been a heavier winter.
This is a hard winter.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting is a couple weeks ago, I saw a pronghorn on the refuge.
Yeah.
And the elk herd had moved away from the place that they were feeding them, and the pronghorn was picking up all the scraps, all the little leftover pieces of alfalfa. Yeah. So one beneficiary of the
feeding program.
This poor little pronghorn that wasn't able to migrate.
That's great. Don says tons of skunks in Illinois right now. We'll send you a few. Please post address. On the one hand, that sounds great. On the other hand, that sounds like a terrible idea. I do know people who keep skunks for pets. I don't encourage exotic animals or keeping wildlife for pets, but I kind of, while I say that and I'm all being self-righteous, it does sound kind of fun to have a pet skunk.
I feel like I've seen YouTube videos of pet skunks,
Yeah.
and they're pretty cute. But, social media, YouTube doesn't always give the full story.
I'm sure it
of
doesn't. I'm sure they also
the
have very
animal.
bitey teeth.
And claws. They
yeah.
dig a lot.
So yeah, Don, sorry, I think we're gonna skip the skunks, but I appreciate the offer. We really get excited when we see them here, so that's pretty cool.
I grew up in a place with a lot of skunks. They used to steal our strawberries from under my parents' bedroom window,
way.
and my mom has the most sensitive nose. Hi, Mom, if you're watching. And it would wake her up like every single night, and my dad would like chase skunks through the neighborhood.
Seems like a great way to get sprayed by a skunk to me.
He was never sprayed, and I don't know how he got sprayed, but I would always
wow.
hear him saying curse words and downstairs and running outside.
Get them skunks.
Get the skunks, yeah, and going after them.
I never knew any nuisance skunks growing up, so that's a new one for me. I did work as a veterinary technician in college and a little bit later on, and I had to clean a lot of dogs that had made choices about skunks, and that was enough for me to not need to get near a skunk.
I think I've said this before. I've been sprayed by a skunk when I was 9.
Did you throw up? Everybody always says they throw up.
I threw up, and I got it on my chest, which was because I was facing it, and I was 9 years old, and I was just playing in the backyard, and the grass was super long, and I didn't see it until it was literally 5 feet away, and it did its little tap thing, and I turned it until it sprayed me. And I didn't throw up right there, but I threw up, I think, on the porch while my mom was trying
Did you have to sleep outside?
No, they just threw me in the bathtub with tomato sauce.
Yeah, does that work?
It actually works.
Okay,
the
because it
clothes
doesn't
were
work very well on
ruined.
dogs.
I think it worked on me. I mean,
You don't have as much hair as a dog, I think.
Yeah, I think it comes off of skin easier.
Yeah.
I think maybe head hair is an issue. I was 9, so it's a little hard for me to remember exactly, but I definitely threw up on the porch.
Traumatizing.
Yeah, I think skunks are cool, but
Maybe.
I can definitely
You don't need to pet one.
when I smell them, if you know when they're roadkill, it's definitely brings some traumatic memories back.
Okay. Sadie, I asked a question, but you ran out of time. This must have been last month. Regarding delayed implantation, does it happen all at once, or are the cubs born during one event or several? Oh, this is a great question. I'm sorry we missed it last month because I love talking about delayed implantation. So you're saying cubs, so I'm assuming in this case there's lots of different kinds of mammals that practice delayed implantation, including most of those weasels, again, that we were talking about earlier. But since you're saying cubs, I'm assuming you're talking about bears. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with what the heck we're talking about, delayed implantation is a strategy that some animals use where they will breed at one time of year, and then they'll hold those fertilized eggs in stasis and not implant them into their uterus until another part of the year. So they're not implanted right away. A bear is a good example of this. Grizzly bears, for instance, will breed in May, but they won't implant that fertilized egg into their uterus until early winter, late fall. So early December is not an unusual time. Those animals will then grizzlies will give birth to very premature young. And then those animals will nurse while they're hibernating. So first and foremost, that's what the heck we're talking about. But lots of, we're saying, lots of the weasel species, pine martens and wolverines also practice delayed implantation. It's just not bears. This is of great interest to human science, because if we could understand how bears, which are reproductively really close to humans in terms of the organs and the metabolic systems, if we could figure out how they're practicing that would make a tremendous difference for fertility problems in humans. And if we could figure out how to hold those fertilized eggs in stasis like that, that would be really helpful for people who struggle with that. So it's something that's been studied pretty extensively as a result, because we're more fascinated on how we can use that for human medical science and maybe a little less interested on how bears do it. We don't necessarily know. There's a lot of questions about it.
I'm such a wildlife nerd that I often don't think of how this could also affect people. And so my brain just went about
the other one
That's
that's really
insane.
studied for bears is hibernation, because when bears go into hibernation, they tend to not waste away their muscles, and they wake up with perfect muscle tone, and there's no atrophy. So when we induce coma in humans who are suffering from really traumatic brain injuries and these other things, oftentimes atrophy of limbs can be so severe that they will lose the ability to walk or have good movement after that happens. If we could figure out what metabolic pathways are being used by bears to maintain good muscle tone while they're in what is kind of a coma-like state, that would be enormously helpful for medical science as well.
You know what's going through my head right now? Space travel.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
No. Some of these studies have actually been paid for by NASA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Bears and zoos.
Bears might influence space travel.
Whoa.
Who knew?
But, okay,
That's
Sadie,
incredible.
we fell off
Yeah.
the wagon here. So yes, a female can breed with multiple males. And multiple males' offspring can implant into her uterus, and her offspring can be from more than one male, which I think is what you're asking.
And then correct me if I'm wrong. I've heard that part of the environment, there's some environmental stimulus on when they implant, and it has to do partially when they go into hibernation, and then also on the female's body
Condition.
Body condition.
This is really hard to understand, but the female will only implant as many embryos as her body condition allows. So she may fertilize, the male sperm may fertilize multiple eggs, but she's only going to implant as many as her body can support. So when we talk about multiples, for instance, grizzly bear 399 is very famous for having triplets or quadruplets. Before 399, the estimation was that grizzly bears only had offspring based on body condition. We now know that there's probably a little more genetic element to it, but if the bear was in very, very, very good condition and she had a lot of body fat going into hibernation, it might implant 2 or 3 eggs, and then might have 2 or 3 cubs and viable offspring. But if she was in poor body condition, she might just implant 1 or 2. Or if she was in very poor body condition, her body might not implant any. Now, it's not like the bear is sitting there going, I think I'll have 2 cubs. She's not making an active decision how many offspring she's having. Her body is sort of assessing its overall ability to bear offspring. So it's a little confusing. Even though she might have fertilized eggs ready to implant, they may not implant if she doesn't have a good summer and fall and doesn't get enough food in her system for hibernation. So it can be really complicated. Grizzly bear 399 kind of threw that hypothesis for a little bit of a loop because she keeps having multiples, and sometimes her body condition was not like epically good. You shouldn't be having quadruplets unless you are just as round as can be going into hibernation. There's no way you should be implanting 4 unless there's a genetic component. And there seems to be some evidence to support that because grizzly bear 399's offspring also tend to have a higher density of multiples, triplets and things like that than the average population. So there might be a genetic element, just like there is in people. People who are twins are more likely to bear twins. It may be with bears who are the offspring of the mothers who have multiples will also have multiples themselves.
Exactly. And also, we just went through February, which is when most bears are born.
Yeah.
And so, happy birthday to all the bears of the world, or I guess of North America. North America.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. These bears, they have to have enough body fat to get through hibernation and to grow these embryos, and then also to nurse them. Yeah. So, which kind of blows my mind a little bit that they actually can have the body reserves to do that, and that 399 one bear had enough body reserves for 4. Which is incredible. So, and these bear cubs, they look small next to their mothers when they come into hibernation, but they're not that small. No. They're like, I don't know. They're like,
when they're born, they're tiny.
Yeah, but when they come out and they're still nursing, they're actually a fairly good size.
I've had people over the years ask me, does the mother wake up when she goes into labor because the babies are so small? So I have looked into that with the zoo bears that they've studied. Yes, they do wake up, but they don't seem to be in terrible discomfort. As somebody who had a baby myself, I'm jealous. I would have liked to have had an offspring that was like that big. That would have been really helpful.
About the size of a soda can?
Yeah, that's crazy to me. But that's not how it works for people, so we're all going to have to deal with it, but so it goes. But yeah, happy birthday, baby bears.
Yeah, and happy birthday, I guess, 399, and everyone else
out there. Every bear
yeah.
out there, I guess, right? Because January, February is when they're born. So that was a great question. Thank you for that. Mary asks, with all the snow this winter, any predictions of flooding along the Snake River this spring? And will the snowmelt delay the rafting and float trips? Ooh, good question. Do you want this one or you want me to take it?
I can talk about this one. Yeah, so we're having an above average snow year. We have a lot of snow. I'm actually I might go back home after this and shovel my driveway because I have yet to do that in 2 days. And so,
sorry,
besides the shoveling, Fortunately, Ben is off in Idaho actually right now.
So it's just you
You
can do what I do, which is all of our vehicles have clearance, so we sometimes don't shovel
My-
and we just
My
put it
truck
in four-wheel
has-
drive.
That's what I do. My truck has really high clearance, and I just go right over it.
Yeah.
Which is fine.
That's my
but-
fail at adulting, but anyway.
But anyway, besides shoveling the driveway, we're definitely excited because this could fill up our reservoirs. I think we talked a little bit about this last month about Wyoming, Idaho water rights and how we have to send a certain amount of water to Idaho every year and how our reservoirs are pretty low. And so we're hoping that this increases the amount of flow, the amount of volume in our reservoirs. As far as rafting, it's probably going to mainly affect the start time. It'll probably be a little bit later, but this all depends on snow melt, and it all depends on how much snow we get over the coming months and the temperatures. In Colorado, when I was doing my undergrad, I did a project called Riverwatch, and that's where we estimated when the peak flow of the river would be based off of the spring temperatures and the snow layer. And we found that both affects it. So it's not just the amount of snow that affects how much water is going down the river at one time. It also depends largely on temperatures. It depends on how quickly that's melting. And it's good for us to have years where it's actually colder in the spring because that water will melt slower. That reduces the risk of flooding. It also means that we can sustainably take water from our reservoirs while it's being resupplied instead of all the water going in at once and then us having to rationing it over the summer. And so we definitely hope for cooler springs, even though I know some of us are probably dying for 70-degree days, 80-degree days
I'm
by the
still
time
enjoying-
April,
I'm
like,
still enjoying
yeah.
skiing. Talk to me
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
month.
Okay,
We'll
okay,
see.
yeah.
Personally, anyway.
Yeah, and so it totally depends on those factors. And then obviously safety is a big factor for the rafting companies. And so they will make a decision based off of the volume of the water coming down the rivers.
No. So, sort of three things that are going on this year that are going to factor into this. Obviously, we've been in a drought for a couple of years. All the snowfall is certainly going to help us with our refill of Jackson Lake, which is a big question. The Wyoming state, I can't remember which department does this, but they don't put out the prospectus for how they feel water levels will be for the summer until March. So any day now, they're going to tell us what they think about the snowpack. They're actually studying it as we speak and then making an idea of how much water will be available for things like irrigation and these other issues, which are going to be a big deal in the West.
Yeah.
We are also replacing one of the most important bridges in Teton County this summer, which goes over the Snake River. So there's a lot of question as to how quickly they're going to be able to get that done based on flood season. So right now, if you are driving between the town of Jackson and Teton Village, like you're driving to the ski hill, you'll drive over what's called the Wilson Bridge. We have two major bridges across the Snake River and then the Jackson Lake Dam. There's three ways to get across. And the main way that everybody gets across needs replacement. They are desperately digging these gigantic gravel dams to reroute the river during flood season so that they can have bridge construction. And it's really fascinating to watch these multi-story gravel bars and dikes being built up. But it's also really interesting to see how the river has changed over time from flood season to flood season. So it'll be interesting to see the Wyoming Department of Transportation versus the natural world and flood season and snowpack.
It's really
and
interesting.
who wins. I'm sure they're nervous because if it had been a mild winter, their lives would be
It'd be a lot easier. Yeah.
But they've got a limited period of time in the dead of winter in sub-zero temperatures to create massive structures down in the river bottom in time for flood season. Which
They're doing it
soon.
right now.
Yeah.
Right now.
20 and they're doing it in the dark. Like they're doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, frantically building these gigantic gravel structures.
One thing that will help them a lot is the Jackson Lake Reservoir is controlled by a dam, and so they can actually control how much water is coming out of that lake. However, there are a lot of other tributaries that could influence the level of flow, most notably the Gros Ventre River, which comes out of the Gros Ventre Mountains, which does get a lot of snow.
Yeah.
And so they at least have that playing in their favor. If it was any other river without a dam, they would be definitely nervous at... Yeah,
But,
they would probably put it on hold, honestly, until the next year.
Yeah, because we've had so much snow. I just feel like they'd probably be like, this isn't our year.
Don't spend the money.
Yeah. But you know, Wyoming Department of Transportation, I'm sure has done this before. Snake River's pretty massive, mighty western river, though,
river.
to try and control. It's also, of course, one of our national wild and scenic rivers, so they're also limited in exactly how and where and why they can build these temporary structures. But the reality situation is we need a new bridge. So they're working with federal agencies and making sure that the river and its biodiversity is protected while also enabling us to travel around the county because it's a pretty important spot. So look, I've been thinking about this, you know, I'm watching them build these huge structures and it's all very impressive. We also did things like built the Hoover Dam. So I'm sure they know what they're doing. It's just fun for the layperson like me to watch.
We're not civil engineers, so
Yeah, we don't
and
know.
all
It's
we
just
read
impressive.
about are like floods that like wipe out town, like the flood in Yellowstone last year, and so we're over
We don't
here
know.
like
We're just watching going, wow, are you sure this is a good idea? I'm sure it is, but I don't know.
these civil engineers. I'm sure
I'm
are,
so impressed.
are genius. And
Yeah,
they know
if you're a
what
civil
they're
engineer,
doing,
you're
but,
shaking your heads like, oh, those biologists, they don't know
what-
anything.
They'll be fine. Yeah.
Skunks were your people, but civil engineering. Yeah,
Bridge making,
yeah, not my skill
build
set.
bridge building.
Hey, I won the bridge building competition in 8th grade.
With popsicle
Yeah,
sticks.
women in
Yeah,
STEM for the win.
that's awesome.
It's like the only thing I won, so I'm gonna stick with it.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I think we've gotten to everybody's questions. If for some reason we missed yours, I'll be sure to get to as many of them I can this week in the comment section. Like if you're not watching this live and you have questions, go ahead and let us know and we will get them answered. Big special thanks to Bo answering comments in the comment section tonight. This is Bo's first time moderating our comment section and he did an amazing job. So make sure you thank him as well. Guys, it has been a pleasure spending this Wednesday with you. We are on every month, the first Wednesday of every month at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And we're always live, so feel free to join us anytime you want. And have a great March, everybody.
Yeah, and if Leslie is watching this time, I wanted to say hi and thanks for coming on tour with me. It was great seeing you. So I just want to do a little shout out.
Great. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
We've had a bunch of Wildlife Wednesday watchers over the last week coming out on tour.
Exactly.
Which has been a delight. So thank you guys so much for your support. We adore you. All right. Have a great month, everybody.
Awesome.